I think you go into really good discussion when you talk early about the native people, and you talk about the idea of injustices, and you point out, what injustices did take place or happened, tied to, say, European incursion. But you also don't. I guess you don't. You don't go too far, as you said in your book early. You said humans are humans. Can you kind of talk about the injustices, because you point out there were also injustices between the natives themselves?
Well, the Dutch they were pioneers in the development of religious toleration, which is allowing other religions. And the interesting thing about that is intolerance at the time was official policy everywhere in Europe. The
Sure.
Spanish, the French, the English. The thinking was, it's a dangerous world out there. If we are going to survive, we have to be on the same page. Religion is a hideously divisive force. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a state religion, and we're not going to allow any others. We're going to push them out if they're from other faiths. The Dutch ended up doing something almost the opposite. They said, we're going to have an official policy of toleration of religions. Goes back to the year 1579, which made them very unusual. And from the perspective of other Europeans, it set them up for all kinds of internal weakness. However, the opposite happened. They became arguably the most powerful nation, this little country, the most powerful nation in the world for a time, partly on the back of this notion of religious toleration. And that relates to a number of things. One, they were business people who traded all over the world. They therefore learned other languages and other perspectives. They saw the value, they saw the practical value in being that way. So this is, I think, truly a watershed and an important thing. On the other hand, as you suggested, it had limitations. Essentially, Dutch toleration applied to other white European Christians. Mm-hmm. And everybody beyond that was something else. So which we'll probably talk about in a few minutes, they began the slave trade in what would later become New York.
Sure.
Obviously, this toleration, they did not view Africans in a way that would apply toleration to them. Likewise with the native peoples, not just in this colony of New Netherland, but in other places where they were their empire was spread to. They were somehow other. They were in a different category. Another category, too, is Jews. There's the situation of Jews in this colony is an interesting one. There was a small Jewish population. They had to continually fight for their rights. Peter Stuyvesant, like any Christian of the 17th century, was deeply anti-Semitic. He thought that the Jews had killed Jesus Christ. They were the people who didn't recognize his divinity, and he didn't want Jews in the colony. But these Jews wrote to the home country and appealed over his head, and he was overruled. They said, yes, they're right. There is this policy of toleration. You have to put up with them. So, I think you have to hold two things in your head at the same time here. Okay. One is, yes, toleration was seen as a value, and it spawned this pluralistic society that became New York's, pluralism. At the same time, it was limited, and as you say, they were humans dealing with things in the way what they saw was common sense.
Yeah, to your point on the anti-Semitism, I always tell people times change and demons don't, and that seems to be a demon that reoccurs in human society pretty regularly. You really kind of pose this idea of toleration up against, New Amsterdam, what we now know as New York, against Puritan Boston. So can you kind of talk about Puritan Boston in comparison to what you just discussed? Because if someone says, well, they're not that tolerant in New Amsterdam, well, it's a relative game in the new America.
Yeah. So what we've mostly been talking about the Dutch side of the story. The English side of this piece of history is the 17th century in England. You had a society that was bitterly split into two camps, and each one thought the other was out of their minds. This may sound familiar to Americans today.
Yep.
The one hand, starting in the beginning of the 17th century, the Puritans become more and more powerful as the decades roll on. They wanted to purify the Church of England. They broke away, and they thought that the Church of England was wicked, and the king, the Stuart kings, were the king was by definition the leader of the Church of England. So it's a corrupt church with a corrupt monarchy, and they were breaking away, purifying, and they wanted to rebuild English society along the lines that they thought were correct. That the other side is called the Royalists, but I think that's a little bit misleading, because it doesn't just mean people who, were crazy about the monarchy and wanted to follow them. It basically encompassed everyone who did not want the Puritans to take over and, as the Puritans would do, outlaw Christmas and outlaw dancing and theater and things like that.
Kissing in public, anything fun.
Sure. Yeah. This builds to a civil war. When the Puritans take control, they capture Charles I, the king. They cut off his head. His two sons flee into exile, and eventually then they come back onto the throne in 1660 and take over again. Now, while all this is going on in America, starting early in the century, you have Puritans settling in New England.
Sure.
And Boston becomes their center, their power base, and they become quite strong and quite dominant with this very rigid ideology, which, to me, if you look back at 17th century English Puritanism, at that brand of it anyway, it is really a form of religious extremism. And that was what they imposed. That's how they structured the society. And so in terms of New Netherland and what was going on there, it's quite a different place from New England, especially from Boston.